Okay, so let's start. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joao Morciani. I'm an analyst for feedstocks and biofuels based in Brazil. I'm the specialist in the South American markets, and this is the August 22nd webinar for fats, fuels, and oils. Um, Today, I will be talking a little bit about the past crop in South America and what were the impacts of the South American crop in the vegetable oils market, and also our expectations for the next crop that will be planning in the next month here down here in South America. So um, I want to start this presentation showing you this information, which is the Brazilian soybeans acres increase. In the past 4 years, we have experienced a really strong increase in acreage. 17.6 million acres were added to the Brazilian acreage from 2019 to 2020, and that sharp increase that was much higher than the average rate from the past seasons was basically driven for three main drivers. So the first one was the profitability. Exceptional profitability levels in the past seasons fueled both countries' acreage and also investment. When we look at credit data for investment, we can see that investment was much higher than other kinds of credit, and that's mostly because of the general optimism that we were living here in the past 4 years. Um, so soybean prices were super high, and that led input costs weren't that high on the 2021 and the 1920 season, and on 21 22 and 22 23 we've experienced some drops on the profitability levels because of the input cost that rose a lot on the 21-22, mostly driven by the agrochemicals prices that skyrocketed due to these disruptions caused by the COVID pandemic. And in 22-23, input costs rose mostly because of the effects on the Russian and Ukraine war, especially on the fertilizers market. So net margin on last crop on 21-22 crop was about around 59% of the general costs, while this current season the net margin went to 23%, and mostly because of the reduction on soybean prices. And because of that, we are expecting a acreage increase that will go back to the historical average from the seasons before those four exceptional years. The other driver that was key to understand this huge acreage increase, if you look to the US data from 1920 to 22-23, the US added 11 million acres, so we can understand how big was this expansion in Brazil. The other the other the other driver is the land availability. Brazil basically have 170 million acres of agriculture, which 100 is dedicated to soybean planting, and we have another 420 million acres of pasture that can be converted to cropland. So with that said, we can understand that we have plenty of room to expand our cropland area, and there's no constraint on it. We fueled a little bit more this general optimism in the soybean market down here in Brazil. And the other driver is the general optimism supported by the political scenario. On 2018, we have a shift in the government, and the government that got elected, the candidate that got elected, was much supported by the agribusiness players, and that brought another component to this optimism, a kind of ideological component to this general optimism. Before I worked in fast markets, I was working in AgroConsult, which is one of the major consultancy companies for agribusiness in Brazil, and they had a product that is the Brazilian Confidence Index. I'm sorry, it's the Brazilian Agribusiness Confidence Index. And I was responsible to connect the results with the market dynamics, the market outlook. And in the past 2 years, it was really interesting to see how, even though market conditions weren't that good, this ideological component, was boosting the the market optimism. So with that said, I want to introduce you a little bit about the crop conditions from the past season. So last crop season in South America was marked by multiple scenarios. In Brazil, if you look at Mato Grosso, which is over here in the Midwest, we can see that we had pretty good rainfall on 2022 on October, which is the planting season. And this great weather led to a record planting pace in Mato Grosso. And planting pace is quite a deal in Brazil because the planting calendar is super important for farmers, especially from the Midwest, because they plant the second crop. So, in order to reduce their weather risks for both corn and cotton that will be planted on the second crop on the soybean areas, they have, as soon as they can start planting, it's better for them. It's better to avoid weather risk to crops that are more sensitive to the weather, to the lack of the rainfall, like cotton and especially like corn. And at the same time, Argentina was facing the most severe drought last year. So this year, I'm sorry. So as you can see it in this graph on your left, we can see that on October, where they started planting, they basically had no soil moisture, and they were needing the moisture that the crop would require to develop and make good yields would need to come from the rainfall that didn't come. So that set up the scenario for a crop disaster that Argentina experienced this year, and that led us to a disaster that Argentina is facing right now. This slide I brought so I can explain a little bit more the Brazilian geography, and also bring some debate, some discussion on the yields and the geographical difference from Brazil and Argentina. So last season we had a 52.1 bushels per acre, which is a yield record in Brazil. And something that was quite interesting in this year was that the excellent weather in most parts of Brazil, they supported a scenario that we could test new technologies' full potential. So at the same time that we had pretty bad yields on the Rio Grande do Sul, which is the state in the south of Brazil. As you can see, we have 29 bushels per acre in Rio Grande do Sul, which basically Rio Grande do Sul basically has the same weather pattern from Argentina, and that's why they had this such a pretty bad yield. Even though they recovered from past season that were even worse, they reached something around 20 bushels per acre last season, 23, something around that. Um, so that scenario, that great weather, was able to give us some anecdotal reports of record yields in Mato Grosso, in a lot of big growing areas in the Midwest, farmers surpassing the threshold of 63 bushels per acre. They weren't rare, and it shows the new level that yields can reach because of new technologies. And over here we have Brazilian market has basically two magical numbers. One of them is the 60 bags per hectare, which is around 53 bushels per acre. Uh, and this magical number, there's a big question ongoing for the past 5 to 10 years in Brazil. That is when Brazil will be able to surpass this mark, and we almost did it. We just did not, because we had 10 million tons withdrawal from the market because of the drought in Rio Grande do Sul. So if everything goes right next year with the shift on the weather pattern from La Nina to El Nino, that will not hurt that much yields in Rio Grande do Sul, we might be able to surpass this threshold that's been on the market minds for quite a long time. Uh, so that led us to this production outlook. So last on the 21-22 season, we had a crop failure in some parts of Brazil, especially in Rio Grande do Sul, in Paraná, which is another state in Brazil, in the south of Brazil, and is the second largest producer. Um, we also had some problems in a Mato Grosso do Sul, which is a Midwest state that is nearby Paraguay. So they have a similar weather pattern, and Paraguay was a disaster as well on the 21-22 season. They produced basically half of their potential. So with that said, we had another 400 million bushels added to the market from the 21-22 season. And that was basically the yield recovery in Brazil, led by the Midwest yields. Um, and we got this cut of nearly half, actually more than half of the Argentinian crop. So we got a reduction of 900 million bushels of the crop potential if we add the 600 million bushels from Argentina and another 300 million bushels from Rio Grande do Sul. And because of that, we are seeing some impacts on the soybean oil market. The drought in Argentina, it has driven a short-term shift in the soybean oil trade flows, not only the soybean oils, but the grains itself as well. And while Brazil has been increasing its market share, in part of the because of the decline of the U.S. exports, as the U.S. feedstock demand has been growing really sharply in the past 3 years. Uh, the U.S. is getting to a turning point to become an importer, and so it will shift this position from an exporter to an importer. And the Argentina drought accelerated this trend of Brazilian gaining market share in the soybean oil market. And there's another factor that boosts this trend, that is the economical and political situation in Argentina. Argentina is facing one of the most severe crises, and most a big part of their economic crisis is their inflation. They're facing over 100% inflation per year this year, and mostly was driven by the devaluation of their exchange. So Argentinian farmers are used to this high level of inflation, and they have a practice of keeping their grains stored so they can have it as a reserve of value, as a value of reserve. And so that will slow down their export space. It will slow down their soybean crushing, in order to, if they need money, they prefer to have beans that they can sell it for US dollars, instead of having pesos in their hand. And because pesos are devaluating so fast that they can predict, it's safer to have beans than pesos. Argentina is facing a pretty critical period in their history. Last week they have a pretty unique thing over there, that is their primary elections. So basically, they will vote to their to the candidates that will run election in the next year. And last week, the candidate that won, he made some pretty controversial statements that led to a 30% devaluation of the Argentinian pesos. So with that in mind, we can assure that the Argentinian farms will try to save as much beans as they can, even though they have this such tight supply. And when we see it, if Brazil is stealing market share from Argentina, it is. If we look at the soybean oil exports market share to the main countries of both countries, which is Bangladesh, China, and India, um, those three countries, they account for 86% of the soybean oil exports from Brazil and 60% from the Argentina soybean oil in Brazil in the last 5 years. We can see that Brazil went from 13% of market share in 2020 to 40% in this year from January to July data, and surpassing the Argentina market share for the first time. And that led us to a question that is this trend is just a short-term trend, is just a short-term impact due to the tighter supply in Argentina, or Brazil will be able to sustain this position and become a major soybean oil exporter. Okay. Due the last season's crop failure in Argentina and this really tight domestic supply, Argentina is relying on imports from Brazil. As we can see it, Argentina average monthly crush is 21% above the 5-year average. And at this, it's way below its average from 2021, and especially from 21, 22, and especially from 2021. And at the same time, we have an opposite scenario in Brazil. So Brazil is crushing 20% above its 5-year average, and it has been reaching records in 4 consecutive months. Brazil have plenty of crushing capacity to expand its crushing, which is not the case from Argentina. And the market right now is over here is asking if are we gonna be able to expand our crushing with no investments on crushing capacity, or do I need to expand the crushing capacity in Brazil before uh, do a sharp soybean crush volumes to the market? Um, okay, and now I want to talk a little bit about the next crop season. And in order to understand that, I brought this graph so we can see the La Nina and the El Nino impacts on yields in both countries. So as we're shifting from La Nina to El Nino, we are expecting that Argentina will come back to the yield trend line. As you can see, the yield average deviation from the trend line in Brazil is minus 22% in La Nina years and minus 27% in Argentina, while in El Nino years, Argentina yield deviation was 29% above the trend line in the past 20 years. So we are expecting a good recovery in both Argentina and the south of Brazil yields, and that will put another almost billion bushel of supply in the next season if everything goes right. However, there's some potential for Brazilian yields in the northern growing areas, uh, which is the biggest producers in Brazil, to decline relative to the last year due to the speed of the transition in the sea surface temperatures. Um, if we look to the Pacific sea surface temperature, we can see that it's shifting pretty fast and much more aggressive than in the past years, and that might lead it to more extreme impacts in the yields in Brazil. Hopefully, we will not see that. The weather outlook for next month, it's pretty good. We are expecting rainfall for Mato Grosso and the whole Midwest. Right now, Mato Grosso's winter is pretty dry. I was there 3 weeks ago and it was drier than it usually is. However, with this outlook of with the rainfall forecast that is quite good for the next month, some organizations already could surpass a could ask the government to change. There's something in Brazil that's called the sanity vacuum, which is basically the government, it forbids planning anything from July 1st to September 15th in order to keep in control pests and any kind of biological disease because we don't have a winter as cold as the northern hemisphere winter. So they have this vacuum law to make sure that they there will there's no biological bridge from from the past crop to the next crop. And doing this because of this good outlook for September, they could anticipate the planning in 15 days. So they would be able to start planning on September 15th, but now they will be able to plan on September 1st, which is great for soybean farmers and even greater for cotton and corn farmers that relies a lot on the planning calendar. Okay. And with that said, this is our 23-24 South America soybean production outlook. So we will produce 6.1 billion bushels, and mostly because of the shift on the weather pattern from La Nina to El Nino that will recover yields in Argentina. So we are expecting to add another billion bushels to the market. Excuse me, and that will absolutely weigh on world oilseed values. If everything goes right with the American crop, and if we don't have any major challenges in South America, we will face a there's a good possibility of a good drop on soybean prices for the next year. And so far the conditions are pointing to that. I mean, if we look to the American crop, planning was kind of hard. The weather wasn't that good, but we are seeing right now a crop condition recovery, and yields are a little bit below the historical trend. However, it's not a disaster, and probably the US will harvest plenty of soybeans. And if there is no major incidents in South America, we will all be fine, and there will be a lot of beans in the market next year. Um, okay. With that said, I want to talk a little bit about the domestic feedstock demand in Brazil. So Brazil biodiesel feedstock demand grew by 1 million cubic meters since 2018. We had a change in our biodiesel mandate that went from 10% to 12% last April, and will continue to rise 1% each year until 2016, that will reach 15% of the mandate volumes. That shift frustrated market expectations. Um, Market was expecting 14% for this year already, and then a sharp increase for 2026 of something around, some people were talking about 17%, some other 15% of blending. Even though it wasn't as big as the market was expecting, Brazil feedstock demand is growing, and as you can see it in the biodiesel feedstock mix, most of our feedstocks is soybean oil. Basically, 70% of our feedstocks for biodiesel is soybean oil, and the other 30% is animal fats and yellow grease, which animal fats is mostly tallow. Um, and right now, we are facing another outlook for the biodiesel market in Brazil that it won't it won't change like it won't cause a change like in the US that it's going from a soybean oil exporter to a importer. However, Brazil exports. If Brazil grows demand as it's growing right now, if the trends goes like that, and if the plans that, as I told you, we had a government change that it's more aligned to the energy transition market, and it wants to pose Brazil as a key player on the energy transition, which just announced in the last month that Brazil will start producing renewable diesel. They will invest in Petrobras, which is the biggest Brazilian company. It's an oil and gas company. They will invest 600 million US dollars by 2026 to start producing renewable diesel. And if that trend sustains, Brazil might do not have that much room to expand its exports and may keep our exports steady and while our domestic demand will grow. And also there's a the economic scenario in Brazil supports starting to invest in the energy transition. We are finally cutting our interest rates that are the biggest real interest rates in the world. So cutting interest rates will help us to create conditions to private investment on the renewable diesel and the biodiesel industry down here in Brazil. And when you look to the side to the Brazilian crushing capacity, we can see that Brazil increased its capacity by 17% in the past 10 years, while Argentina increased its capacity by 27% in the past 10 years. However, Brazil crushing capacity is 31% above the domestic crush. So we have plenty of room to expanding our crushing capacity with no investments. Meanwhile, Argentina's outlook is completely different. They have much less room. They have something around 5% uh, to expand with no investments in their crushing capacity. And when we think about the current scenario, the current economic and political scenario, it's not likely that they will invest in any any crushing capacity. Next year they will be having elections, and elections in Latin American countries are pretty tough. People try to usually hold their investments after the election so they can figure a little bit better how it's gonna be the next years, and if it makes sense to make those investments doing the political shifts. And last, brought the soybean oil export bases from Gulf and Argentina. So we have a 17.65 cents per pound is the average basis spread between the Gulf and the Argentina upriver. And as we can see it's a pretty big gap that is widening. It reached more than 25 cents, sorry, more than 33 cents. And even though it's far away from the historical trend of those spreads, we are not, it didn't trigger a substantial increase in the US imports. And that I remember that Tories talked about a little bit about that in the past weeks. That basically, as the U.S. Was a major soybean oil exporter, the soybean oil players they do not have long relationships with soybean oil exporters from other countries. They have with importers. and building those relationships takes time and it's not as easy as we can think. However, when I was putting together this slide, um, I thought something that I want to share with you, that is, every time that we need to every time that any major shift on the supply chain happens, it's really costly, it's ineffective, and usually takes longer than we expect to that shift make uh to that shift bring supplies back to its normal. However, in the past 3 years, we experienced major supply chain disruptions from the COVID, from the pandemics, on 2020, and the most recent one was on 2022. I remember that in March of 2022, when the Russia and Ukraine war started, a lot of people were saying that Europe would freeze on their winter because they would have no heating oil or natural gas, and that didn't happen. The market showed its resilience, and maybe, and that's just a maybe, uh, there's a shift on the way that market will adjust the supply chains disruption. So what I mean is, if this gap, this spread continues as wide as it is right now, even though it's costly and it's different from the historical trend, uh, this last 3 years showed us that is, even though it's costly and it's not that effective, it is possible. And if that makes sense in the long term, that will definitely happen, and we can see a shift on the trade flows dynamics. um, and that's it what I brought to you guys. Thank you very much. Let me see if I have, and if you have any question, I will be happy to answer it. And if you don't have it right now, you can always email me or Tori, and I'll be happy to answer you guys. Let me see if I have any question. Yeah, no. Okay. So this is it. Thanks again. And if you have any question again, please email us. We'll be happy to answer you. Bye bye.